So I'm here with Dave O'Reilly of FTR Solutions. Thank you for joining us. Let's start by talking about the content of your presentation. You talk about a holistic approach to tackling fraud. And I just want to really find out what you mean by that, a holistic approach. So could you tell us?
The notion of the presentation that was delivered yesterday was that people use fraud management systems or use their monitoring system, particularly in the case of ATMs, for pretty normal things. They use them for making sure that the ATMs are working okay. They use them for remote updates. They use them for, and so on and so on. What we were proposing is we can learn lessons from other areas, and in particular from the card issuing world, where they're very good at detecting fraudulent patterns of behaviour. And why don't we in the ATM monitoring world, why don't we learn something from them and apply what they already know to all this data that is being gathered? So, for example, to give you an idea of the types of things that the fraud monitoring, the card monitoring world use, they have kind of the three categories: known patterns of fraudulent behaviour. So that would be the first type. The next one is blacklists and hotspots and so on. So, like for instance, areas, cards that are known to be stolen or known to potentially have been stolen. And the third is deviations from an individual behaviour, expected behaviour pattern. So, what I was asking was, how can we map these ideas through into the ATM world and use them as the basis for developing patterns that could help us to proactively prevent fraud in the ATM world? So we've got, for example, known patterns of fraudulent behaviour. To give you one example of this, there's an attack that's been done a number of times. It's called a cash claw, and it's put into certain types of ATMs, and it's to stop the cash being. It kind of grabs the cash so that the customer doesn't get it. It's a cash trapping attack. Now, they're put in sometimes. The way they're put in is the criminal comes to the ATM with a prepaid debit card, and they do a small transaction, and this is then used to stage the attack, and then you start to see transaction reversals at the ATM. So this is quite a distinctive pattern of behaviour, and potentially what you could do is you could see a small prepaid debit card transaction followed by one reversal and then go, something fishy is going on, rather than waiting until you've seen 10 reversals or 20 reversals. And you can save yourself money, you can prevent fraud. The kind of the concept of the talk was taking this new look at all this data that is available. So you gather all the data that you have available to you. And now, I'm not talking about investing millions and millions in new monitoring infrastructure. I'm talking about data you already have. Okay, so you gather that data, then you ask yourself some questions that you might like to know the answers to, whatever they may be. For instance, patterns of behaviour that are indicative of fraud. You then look at your pool of data and see whether or not the answers to those questions are contained in the data that you have. They might be or they might not be. Either way, you've gained some insight because you know what you don't know, or you now know an answer to your question. And then finally, hopefully, you're doing this with the aim of identifying an action that you can take to prevent fraud. So this model, and I was giving lots of examples then of how you just gather, analyse, gain some insight, and then take some action. And that was basically how I propose a holistic approach.
We've done reports on Finextra really recently, and I'm sure you know about it, about USB sticks being stuck into ATMs, putting malware in. I also remember a story about POS terminals being infected with malware. Is there any way to combat it, this new creative way of malware?
Well, on the question of whether or not hackers and attackers are getting more creative, what I would say is what they'll actually do is they find what's the easiest vulnerability to exploit. So it used to be, for example, skimming in a restaurant, and then chip and pin came in and that all stopped, and then there was different types of skimming and different types of attacks and so on. And then the fraud moves around the place to different attacks, so you have to constantly evolve your measures that you're using to prevent these types of attacks. In the particular instances that you mentioned, this now, it's very interesting for me to see the extent to which basic information security controls are not being followed. In the POS malware world, the point of sale, they're a big worry because the volumes of card data that can potentially be compromised are enormous. Like, for instance, you potentially read about the breach in Target. This was very widely publicised over the Christmas period. I think it was something like 100 million card numbers. It's like a third of all cards in the United States. It's amazing. So we've got massive amounts of data that are being compromised in those types of attacks. Again, they're much more difficult to deal with, but you're in the world now of PCI compliance, information security controls, and there are kind of understood ways of dealing with those problems, and they generally involve information security best practice.